Hey everyone, and welcome. So let's jump right in. Have you ever wondered what really makes an action a crime? Today, we're going to dig into the two core ingredients that Sri Lankan criminal law looks for to answer one simple question.
Right. So, what's the magic formula? When does something go from just an event to an actual crime in the eyes of the law? Well, it's definitely not just about a bad thing happening. The real answer lies in two key parts that have to be there together.
And those two parts are the act and the mind. Super simple, right? On one hand, you've got the physical thing that happened, the action itself. And on the other, you have the mental side of it. What was going on inside that person's head? For pretty much every crime you can think of, the prosecution has to prove both of these were happening at the same time. Let's kick things off by looking at the physical part, the guilty act. All right, first up, let's talk about the guilty act. You'll hear lawyers call it by its fancy Latin name, actus reus. This is all about the physical side of things. So what does that actually mean? Well, actus reus is basically the forbidden action, or even the forbidden result. It's the part of the crime you could, theoretically catch on a security camera. The actual conduct, the consequences, the part of the whole thing that's physical and out there in the world. Now, here's where it gets interesting. A guilty act isn't always some big, dramatic action. It can actually show up in a few different ways. For sure, it can be a positive act, like someone actually shooting a gun. But believe it or not, it can also be a failure to act, what we call an omission. This happens when you have a legal duty to do something, but you don't. Think of a parent failing to feed their child. And sometimes it can just be a state of affairs, like simply being caught with illegal firearms. The act is just possessing them. Okay, but this brings up a really important question. What happens if the act wasn't on purpose? What if you had zero control over your body at that moment? Does the law still call that a guilty act? And the answer, thankfully, is a clear no. For an act to be considered a guilty act, it absolutely has to be voluntary. Any actions that happen without your conscious control, I'm talking about things like a muscle spasm, a seizure, or something you do while you're passed out, they don't count as an actus reus. The law's pretty clear. You're not held responsible for what your body does when your mind isn't at the wheel. Okay, so we've got the physical act down, but that's only half the story. A physical act all by itself usually isn't enough to make a crime. This brings us to the second, and honestly, often the trickier piece of the puzzle, the guilty mind, or as it's known, mens rea. This is all about the mental side of things. You see, it's not just about what you did. The law cares deeply about what you were thinking when you did it. Was that outcome what you were aiming for? Did you know it was going to happen? Or were you just being incredibly reckless? To get a conviction, the prosecution has to prove what your state of mind was. And get this, not all guilty minds are created equal. The law actually sees it as a kind of ladder. Right at the very top, you have intention. This is the highest level of fault. It means you wanted a specific result and you acted to make it happen. A step down from that is recklessness. This is where you knew there was a big, unjustifiable risk, but you went ahead and took it anyway. And then you have negligence, which is basically failing to see a risk that any other reasonable person would have spotted. All right, let's put this into a practical, if a bit messy scenario. Imagine person A aims a gun to shoot person B. The intention here couldn't be clearer, right? But plot twist, A is a terrible shot. The bullet flies right past B and hits person C, a totally innocent bystander. Now hold on, A never intended to hurt C at all. So does that mean A gets a free pass for what happened to C? No way, not even close. And this is a perfect example of a really cool legal idea called transferred intent. What the law does is pretty clever. It basically says that the guilty mind, that intention to harm, it follows the bullet. It transfers from the person you meant to hit, B, to the person you actually hit, C. So as far as the law is concerned, A is just as guilty for the crime against C as if they had aimed at them from the very start. So this whole idea that you need both the act and the guilty mind, it's absolutely fundamental. But where did a concept like this even come from? I mean, these ideas didn't just appear out of thin air. To really get it, we need to take a quick trip back in time and look at the long, really fascinating journey of justice right here in Sri Lanka. Sri Lanka's legal system is this incredible tapestry, woven together from so many different threads. Long before any European influence, justice was in the hands of the Sinhala kings, and it was often guided by Buddhist principles. Then the Portuguese arrived, and later the Dutch, who brought with them Roman Dutch law, which, by the way, is still a huge part of the system today.
After them came the British, and they really changed the game, introducing English law, a formal penal code, and the jury system. All of this laid the foundation for the modern, independent system we have now.
And just look at the structure they had in the ancient system. This wasn't some simple one-step process. It was this incredibly sophisticated, multi-layered judicial ladder. A case would literally climb its way up through all these different officials, from initial hearings and fact-finding missions, all the way to the top, to the king for the final judgment. This complex setup really shows a deep commitment to a thorough process. It proves it was never just about what someone did, it was about making sure the judgment was fair and carefully weighed at every single level.
And throughout this long history, you see these amazing moments of progressive reform. I mean, think about it. As early as the 3rd century, you have King Tissa abolishing torture. Fast forward to the 13th century, and King Parakamarabahu II gets rid of the death penalty. And then much, much later, the British brought in huge changes, like ending corporal punishment as a way to get confessions. You can see this clear, forward-thinking arc of justice evolving over time.
Okay, so that's the history. But how does all of that rich, complex past shape the system that's in place today? Let's bring it right into the present and take a look at how criminal justice actually works in modern Sri Lanka. The modern system really stands on 3 main pillars. First, you've got the legislature. They're the ones who write the laws, like the penal code. Then you have the police, whose job it is to investigate the crimes and gather all the evidence. And finally, you have the judiciary, the courts that interpret all those laws and are responsible for delivering impartial justice. And the bedrock of this entire structure? That's the 1978 Constitution. It's what officially laid out the hierarchy of courts we have today, cementing the Supreme Court's role as the highest and final court in the land, the ultimate authority. And all of this brings us right back to where we started. There's an ancient Latin saying that just perfectly wraps up everything we've talked about. Actus non facit reum, nisi mens sit rea. It means an act does not make a person guilty unless the mind is also guilty. It's this timeless, powerful principle that connects the physical act with the mental state, and it forms the very foundation of criminal justice, from the courts of ancient kings all the way to the Supreme Court of today. And that leaves us with one final and pretty deep question to chew on. The whole system of justice, when you boil it down, depends on proving what was going on in someone's head, their intention, their knowledge, their recklessness. So here's the thought. Can the law, with all its rules and evidence and procedures, ever truly read a person's mind? It's a tricky one, and it's something to think about.